Got a scholarship from my late grandfather, but then my parents demanded $5,000 for their vow renewal and even called the university pretending to be me to get my money. I, 19M, received a full-ride academic scholarship to my state university last year. The scholarship covers tuition, books, and housing, plus provides a stipend for living expenses. My maternal grandfather was a professor at this university for 40 years, and he established this scholarship fund before he passed away when I was 15. My parents separated when I was 14 and divorced when I was 15, shortly after my grandfather passed away. Their relationship had always been strained. My father worked in construction and often took jobs that required him to be away from home for weeks at a time. My mother worked as a receptionist at a doctor's office but was laid off when I was 11, and she never found another job after that. Every time my father came home, they would argue about money. My mother would complain that we barely had enough to cover our bills. My father would respond by saying he was working 60-hour weeks just to keep a roof over our heads. I would go to my room and put on headphones whenever they started raising their voices. During my freshman year of high school, I began staying late at school for study groups and club meetings, which meant I wouldn't get home until after dinner time. My mother would sometimes leave a plate of food in the microwave for me. Sometimes there would be nothing. In the months before they separated, their arguments became more frequent. One night I came home to find my father throwing clothes into a duffel bag. He walked past me without saying anything and didn't return for a week. When he came back, it was to get more of his things. He had found an apartment across town. The divorce proceedings lasted for months. My father's construction work had started to fail, and my mother had no income of her own. They fought over the house, the car, and the small amount of savings they had managed to accumulate. Neither of them seemed to fight over me. During this time, I spent most weekends with my grandmother, my father's mother, who lived about 20 minutes away. She would pick me up on Friday afternoons and drop me off on Sunday evenings. Sometimes I would find my mother sitting in the same spot on the couch when I returned as when I had left 2 days earlier. Other times, she wouldn't be home at all. After the divorce was finalized, my mother kept the house but had to get a job to pay the mortgage. She found work as a cashier at a grocery store. The hours were long, and the pay wasn't great, but it was something. My father was ordered to pay child support, but his work continued to struggle, and the payments were often late or missing entirely. My grandmother suggested that I come live with her, but my mother refused. She said I needed to stay with her because it looked better if her son lived with her. So I continued to live in my childhood home, though I spent as much time as possible at school or at my grandmother's house on weekends. By the time I was 17, my father's construction work had recovered somewhat, and he was more consistent with child support payments. My mother had been promoted to assistant manager at the grocery store and seemed less stressed about money. They began speaking to each other again when my father would drop off the child support checks instead of mailing them. Last year, I graduated from high school and received the news that I had qualified for my grandfather's scholarship. It would cover all my university expenses for 4 years, as long as I maintained a 3.5 GPA. There would also be a small living stipend paid out each month. I wouldn't have to work during the school year and could focus entirely on my studies. I was planning to major in engineering, the same field my grandfather had taught. The weekend after my high school graduation, my parents invited me to dinner. I assumed it was to celebrate my graduation and scholarship. When I arrived at the restaurant, they were sitting together at a table, holding hands. They announced that they had been dating again for the past 6 months and had decided to renew their vows. The ceremony would take place during the winter break of my freshman year of college. I congratulated them and asked about their plans. That's when they mentioned that they wanted me to contribute to the cost of the ceremony and reception. Specifically, they wanted me to use part of my scholarship stipend to help pay for their vow renewal. They explained that since my education was already covered, I didn't really need the living stipend. They had already picked out a venue and caterer, and the total cost would be around $15,000. They wanted me to contribute $5,000 from my stipend over the next semester. I told them that the stipend was meant for my living expenses while at university. My father responded by saying that I would be living in the dorms with a meal plan, so my expenses would be minimal. My mother added that they had supported me for 18 years, and this was my chance to give something back to them. I pointed out that the scholarship was established by my grandfather specifically for my education, and using it for anything else would be disrespecting his wishes. My father waved his hand dismissively and said my grandfather wouldn't mind if a small portion went toward a family celebration. When I continued to refuse, my mother's eyes narrowed. She said I had become selfish since receiving the scholarship and that I thought I was better than them now that I was going to college. My father added that they had sacrificed everything for me, and now I couldn't even help them celebrate their reunion. I left the restaurant and walked the 2 miles back to my grandmother's house, where I had been staying since graduation. When I told her what had happened, she shook her head but didn't seem surprised. She told me I was welcome to stay with her until it was time to move into the university dorms. The next day, both my parents called and texted multiple times, but I didn't respond. My mother left a voicemail saying I was being childish and that we needed to discuss this as adults. My father sent a text saying I owed them this much after all they had done for me. A week later, my maternal uncle invited the entire family to a barbecue at his house. I didn't want to go, knowing my parents would be there, but my grandmother convinced me it would be better to face them in a public setting rather than avoid them completely. At the barbecue, everything seemed normal at first. My uncle was grilling burgers, my cousins were playing volleyball in the yard, and my mother was chatting with her sister. My father was helping my uncle with the grill. I stayed close to my grandmother and made small talk with my cousins. During dinner, as everyone was seated around the large picnic tables in my uncle's backyard, my mother cleared her throat and announced that she and my father had set a date for their vow renewal ceremony. Everyone clapped and offered congratulations. Then she added, with a pointed look in my direction, that they were having trouble with the budget because someone who had recently come into money refused to help his own parents celebrate their love. The table fell silent. My grandmother put her hand on my arm, but I moved it away and stood up. I told everyone that my mother was referring to my scholarship money, which was intended for my education and living expenses while at university. My father interrupted, saying it wasn't the whole scholarship, just a portion of the stipend that I didn't really need. My uncle, who had always been close to my grandfather, asked if they were talking about the scholarship fund that his father had established. When my mother confirmed this, my uncle's face turned red. He told them it was inappropriate to ask me to use that money for anything other than what my grandfather had intended. My mother argued that family should help family, and since my education was covered, I should be willing to share my good fortune. My father added that they weren't asking for much, just a small contribution to their special day. My grandmother spoke up then, reminding them that they had barely acknowledged my existence during their divorce and the years following. She pointed out that neither of them had contributed a penny to my college fund, while my grandfather had worked hard to establish the scholarship specifically for his grandchildren's education. The argument escalated, with my parents accusing my grandmother and uncle of turning me against them. Other family members began taking sides. Eventually, my parents stormed out of the barbecue, with my mother shouting that I was ungrateful and would regret this decision. The following week, I received a message from my father stating that if I didn't reconsider my decision, I shouldn't bother coming to the vow renewal ceremony. He added that they had been planning to offer me my old room during summer breaks from college, but now I would need to make other arrangements. I replied that I would be staying with my grandmother during breaks and wished them well with their ceremony. I also reiterated that my decision regarding the scholarship money was final. 2 days later, I received a long text message from my mother. She wrote that she had given up her youth and career ambitions to raise me, while my father had worked himself to exhaustion to provide for us. The least I could do was help make their special day perfect. She concluded by saying that my grandfather would be ashamed of my selfishness. I didn't respond to her message. Instead, I focused on preparing for my move to university. My grandmother helped me shop for dorm supplies and promised to drive me to campus on move-in day. The night before I was set to leave for university, my parents showed up at my grandmother's house unannounced. My father demanded to speak with me alone, but my grandmother refused to leave the room. My mother began crying, saying they just wanted one perfect day to make up for all the mistakes they had made in the past. My father added that $5,000 wasn't much compared to the total value of the scholarship, which would cover over $80,000 in tuition and expenses over 4 years. I told them once again that the scholarship was meant for my education, and I wouldn't disrespect my grandfather's memory by using it for something else. My father called me stubborn and selfish, just like my grandfather had been. My mother said I clearly didn't care about their happiness. When I still wouldn't budge, they left, with my father slamming the door behind them. The next day, my grandmother drove me to university. As we unpacked my things in my dorm room, she assured me that I had made the right decision. She said my grandfather would be proud of me for standing my ground and respecting his wishes for the scholarship. During my first semester, I received occasional texts from my mother, mostly sharing news about the vow renewal planning. She never mentioned the scholarship money again directly, but would sometimes make comments about how they had to downsize their plans due to unexpected budget constraints. I kept my responses brief and avoided engaging with these comments. My father rarely contacted me at all, except to ask when I would be coming home for Thanksgiving. When I told him I would be spending the holiday with my grandmother, he replied with a single word, typical. So, Ida for refusing to use my scholarship money to pay for my parents' vow renewal? Update 1. It's been about 5 months since my last post. I just finished my first semester at university and made the dean's list with a 3.8 GPA. My engineering courses were challenging but interesting, and I've joined a robotics club that competes in regional tournaments. My parents went ahead with their vow renewal ceremony last month, though on a smaller scale than they had originally planned. I know this because they posted dozens of photos on social media. They rented a small event space at a local hotel instead of the country club venue they had initially wanted. The catering appeared to be a buffet rather than the plated dinner service they had described to me. About 30 people attended, mostly colleagues from my mother's grocery store and a few of my father's construction buddies. None of my grandparents were there, nor were any of my aunts or uncles from either side of the family. My grandmother showed me the photos when I came to stay with her for winter break. She mentioned that my mother had sent her an invitation at the last minute, but she decided not to attend out of respect for me. I assured her that I wouldn't have minded if she had gone, but she insisted that it was her choice. 3 days into my winter break, my parents showed up at my grandmother's house again. They brought a small Christmas gift for me, a watch that looked expensive. When I opened it, my father pointed out that it was the same brand as the one my grandfather used to wear. My mother added that they had saved up for months to afford it, even with the extra expenses of the vow renewal ceremony. They stayed for about an hour, making awkward small talk about my classes and their jobs. As they were leaving, my mother hugged me and whispered that they had put down a deposit on a rental property as an investment, but were having trouble making the first mortgage payment. She hinted that any help I could provide would be just a loan until the property started generating rental income. I stepped back and told them directly that I would not be providing them with money from my scholarship stipend. My father's face turned red, and he started to say something, but my mother put her hand on his arm and shook her head. They left without another word. Later that evening, my grandmother informed me that she had received several calls from my parents over the past few weeks. They had asked her to convince me to share some of my scholarship money with them. She had refused each time, telling them that the scholarship was for my education only. She apologized for not telling me sooner, but she hadn't wanted to ruin my winter break. I returned to university for my second semester with a sense of relief. The distance from my parents made it easier to focus on my studies. I picked up a part-time job, working 10 hours a week for some extra spending money that wasn't connected to my scholarship stipend. My mother continued to send occasional texts, usually photos of her and my father doing ordinary things like dining out or watching TV together. She never mentioned money directly, but would sometimes include comments about how they were making sacrifices or cutting back to make ends meet. I responded politely but briefly to these messages. My father rarely contacted me at all, except for a terse happy birthday text on my 19th birthday in February. When I thanked him, he didn't respond. Update 2. It's been 6 months since my last update. I completed my freshman year with a 3.85 GPA and secured an engineering internship for the summer at a firm in the same city as my university. The internship is paid, so I've been able to save some money beyond my scholarship stipend. I decided not to return to my hometown for the summer. Instead, I'm renting a small apartment near campus with a classmate who also has a summer internship in the area. My grandmother was understanding and has visited me twice already. My parents' behavior has taken a strange turn. After months of barely communicating with me, they suddenly began calling and texting regularly when they learned I wouldn't be coming home for the summer. My mother claimed they had been planning a family vacation to make up for all the tension over the past year. My father mentioned they had been fixing up my old room, expecting me to stay there. When I explained that I had already signed a lease and committed to the internship, my father accused me of deliberately avoiding them. My mother suggested I was being influenced by my grandmother, who had always disliked her. I reminded them that they had previously told me I wasn't welcome in their home unless I contributed financially. They both denied ever saying this. Last month, they showed up unannounced at my apartment. They somehow convinced a good friend of mine to give them my address. My roommate let them in before I returned from my internship. When I arrived, they were sitting in our living room, looking through my textbooks. My mother had brought a home-cooked meal in plastic containers, and my father was examining our apartment, commenting on things that needed repair. They stayed for 3 hours. During that time, they mentioned multiple times how expensive their new rental property was turning out to be. The tenants had damaged some appliances, and they had to replace the water heater. My father pulled out his phone and showed me photos of the property, pointing out all the work he had done himself to save money. My mother added that they had maxed out 2 credit cards to cover the repairs. Before leaving, my mother hugged me tightly and slipped a piece of paper into my hand. It was a bank account number with a note saying, "Anything you can spare would help." I returned the paper to her and told her again that my scholarship money was for my education only. My father shook his head and muttered something about me becoming just like those academic types who don't understand the real world. After they left, my roommate asked if my parents always acted that way. When I asked what he meant, he said they had spent the entire time waiting for me talking about their financial problems and asking if he knew how much my scholarship stipend was. 2 weeks later, I received an email from the university financial aid office. Someone had called them inquiring about the payment schedule for my scholarship stipend, claiming to be me. When the office asked verification questions, the caller couldn't provide the correct answers and hung up. The financial aid officer wanted to confirm that I hadn't made this call and to remind me never to share my student ID or financial information with anyone. I immediately suspected my parents and called my grandmother to ask if she had heard from them recently. She told me they had visited her the previous weekend, asking detailed questions about my grandfather's scholarship fund and whether there were any provisions for family emergencies that would allow me to access more money. She had shown them the door and called me as soon as they left, but I had been busy and missed her call. After consulting with my grandmother, I decided to meet with the financial aid office in person. I explained the situation and asked what protections were in place for my scholarship fund. The counselor assured me that all disbursements went directly to my student account for tuition and housing, with only the living stipend being deposited into my personal bank account. They added extra security questions to my account and noted that no changes should be made without my appearing in person with ID. I also went to my bank and opened a new account at a different institution, transferring my savings and arranging for my stipend and internship payments to be deposited there. I did not share this information with my parents. 2 days later, my mother called, sounding frantic. She claimed my father had been injured at work and needed surgery that their insurance wouldn't fully cover. They needed $7,000 and had nowhere else to turn. When I expressed sympathy but again refused to provide money for my scholarship, she broke down and admitted they had called the financial aid office pretending to be me. She justified it by saying they were desperate and knew I wouldn't help willingly. She insisted they would pay back every penny once the rental property started turning a profit. I told her what they had done was fraud and could have jeopardized my entire scholarship. I also informed her that I had already taken steps to secure my accounts and that any further attempts to access my scholarship money would force me to take legal action. She began sobbing and handed the phone to my father, who berated me for threatening my own parents and lacking any sense of family loyalty. After that call, I blocked their numbers and email addresses. I spoke with a counselor at the University Student Services office, who helped me create a plan for moving forward without contact with my parents. I'm continuing my internship and focusing on my studies. My grandmother checks in regularly and even spoke with my grandfather's old colleagues to ensure that my scholarship status is secure regardless of my parents' actions.